welcome everyone on this sunny afternoon in Lagos to our UUBO Investigations, Compliance and Ethics Team's September series session on where we'll be looking at ESG for business. We'll be considering trends, challenges, and outlook. So we had a pre-call. We've had some preliminary discussions with this august panel where we were just doing a run through of the session. And Christine, my partner, and I were very stimulated by the discussions, the quality of the discussions and the interplay between the various panelists, notwithstanding the very diverse roles that they play in this sector. And particularly, I think we're going to learn as much as we contribute, not just from each other, but in terms of just learning how the last year, I think, has brought home the reality of the relevance of ESG, not just as a tool in the context of economic development, but in terms of business sustainability. We are privileged as a firm to have, I think we're almost 40 now, but we've always advised a variety of development finance institutions, private equity houses, plethora of businesses and now we advise from the entrepreneurial stage, startups. We have ULaw, which is a startup focused advisory practice that we've set up, right up to the very large businesses, conglomerates, multinationals that we advise. And I think that among sort of what we've begun to see is how often, for instance, Christine and I are in the M&A and private equity practice groups, how often ESG considerations, sustainability considerations are being built even into transaction documents, even into fund documents that we help to draft. And we are particularly honored to have the guests that we have today just spend some time with us and share with us what they're seeing, what challenges they've come across, what their successes have been, and what they think the future looks like. So without too much ado, I'd like to introduce, I'll do a quick run through of the introductions because their bios will show on there, will show as they speak. We're going to begin with, in order of appearance, I should say, we'll begin with Benson Adenuga, who is Head of Office and Coverage Director for the CDC Group in Nigeria. The CDC has been at the vanguard of promoting ESG considerations, helping to drive finance to emerging markets where previously it was not necessarily possible. I don't want to sort of impose too much on his session. He's going to tell us about the CDC's work and also share his unique perspectives. I think just in order, just as a synergy, it makes sense to, after that, listen to Tokumbo. I'm really looking forward to her session as I've been posting on LinkedIn today, because I know that Alethea Capital is unique in its female focus. It has ESG and sustainability built into its DNA and into every investment decision, and the way in which they have evolved a specialized toolkit for female, that focuses on female businesses, is something that I'm looking forward to Tokumbo sharing. After that, we'll be listening to Nicole. I'm going to plague Nicole with a few questions about her experience in policy. Nicole has hitherto been the head of Middle East and Africa for United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing. We're very privileged to have her here. She works with a lot of DFIs and with PMP fund managers that we, Christine and I, tend to work with, and has been a contributor to some of our private equity events in the past. And then we have our lawyer group, last but certainly not least. I'm privileged to be joined by our friend, Sam Eastwood, who's a partner at Mayor Brown, where he is in the white collar practice and will be sharing his white collar defense and compliance practice. And so will be giving us unique perspectives on enforcement. And Sarah Bishop is special counsel at Covington and Burling and is a well-known ESG, shall I say, enthusiast, but it will be very interesting to hear about the European sort of experiences and perspectives that she has come across in her practice. Last but certainly not least will be Mrs. Shijuade Christine, my colleague, who will be sharing her perspectives, what she's seen in our practice. And I'll mention Christine was very much involved in the drafting of our new Companies and Allied Matters Act as part of a team at the firm, and has also added perspectives on governance that I'm looking forward to her sharing with the panel. So without much further ado, I'd like to invite Benson to make his presentation to us. Benson, over to you.
Thank you very much. Please, are you loading the presentation for me, or do you want me to share my screen?
We are. Our IT team will be doing that in a second.
Great. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Folake. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Benson Adenuga.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm the country director for CDC, and I'm based here in Lagos. First of all, I want to say a big thank you to Folake and Christine and UUBO for inviting me to share my thoughts on this very important topic. I see myself as a friend of the house. I've worked with UUBO for a long time, and they continue to be a very valuable partner to me in all the places where I have worked. I also want to say thank you to the formidable panelists that you have put together. Tokumbo, it's good to see you again. It's been a long while, even though we're here in Lagos together. Sam, Sarah, it's good to be here as well. So I really want to do more like a scene setting on this very important topic. I believe many of you on the line know CDC, but for those who don't know CDC, we are the financial institution of the UK government. We're owned exclusively by the UK, and we provide development finance across Africa and South Asia. We have been investing in Africa for over 70 years, and as long in Nigeria as well. In terms of the scope of what we do, we cover both direct investments, where we provide a wide range of instruments, including equity, as well as debt and everything in between, as well as trade finance, to a very wide range of sectors. In addition to that, we are also one of the largest financiers of funds, private equity funds, venture capital funds in Africa. Today, CDC has supported and is supporting over 70 private equity firms in over 30 African countries. That just shows you the depth of experience CDC has in this market. So this is what I'm going to talk about very briefly. I'm going to actually start with really defining the scope of ESG before I come to why I think is more important. And I'm saying that because when we mention ESG, most people tend to think of the environment, which is very important. That is the E part of the ESG acronym. But I'm going to just talk about what else is covered in ESG, the way we look at it as well. After that, I will talk about why I believe ESG is becoming ever more important in the world, not just in Africa, but in the world generally. I will then touch briefly on the approach that CDC has taken in managing ESG risk. You can imagine we work with over 1,000 different companies and funds, and there is an approach we have taken on how we address ESG risk. And lastly, I will just talk about challenges we have seen when businesses have thought about implementing best practice ESG. Please, next 2 slides, please. Thank you very much. So I think the point I want to make here really is to emphasize the fact that when we say ESG, it's very, very broad. The environment is very, very important. We have all seen in recent time the number of adverse weather events that, has, bedeviled the world over. You've seen extreme fires in different places. We experienced in Lagos recently terrible flooding around Lagos. And this is what you are seeing all over the world. And that is the reason why I think the environment is a major consideration. COP26 is coming up, in the next few months. People are preparing towards that in terms of commitment. But the point I want to emphasize is that ESG goes beyond just the environment. As you know, the S is talking about social and the G is talking about governance. And just trying to give you a sense of, how broad this is. I've just highlighted some of the topics here that you can still put under the ESG discourse. Climate change is something we all know and we know really well. And that is what we talk about, the impact on the climate, the temperature actually increasing and what the impact of that will be around the world in terms of sea levels, adverse weather events becoming more frequent. That is something we know that we're all trying to address. But beyond that, there is the issue of pollution. There are businesses, who really pollute the environment a great deal. So it's an important topic that we look at. On the S part, the social is the issue of, labor and working conditions. That is why the topic occupational health and safety is within that scope of when we look at ESG that we all need to be thinking about. And on the governance side, you see, I have a number of topics that relates to governance effectiveness. So board risk oversight, that is part of governance. Board effectiveness is part of governance. Business continuity, planning your succession, they are all part of governance. When we look at this topic called ESG, it's really massive and it's quite big. When I talk about, labor conditions, energy resource and circular economy, how do we maximize what we are able to get from natural resource, electricity, energy, water? How do we maximize that? You see something like animal welfare, you're like, where does that fit into this? That is part of the social aspects, of this. There are people who, develop products and they test this product on animals, and some people are really not happy about that. How about human rights? Then the topic of gender and inclusion is also something that we will look at when we're talking about is how do you manage your waste? There are companies producing, chemicals, textile companies, chemical companies, and there is huge effluent that they're producing as they sort of manufacture their products. Where is that directed to? How do people manage waste? It's all part of this topic that we are really talking about. Then there is issue of community health as well. But one point I want to highlight here, which many people don't think about, especially for infrastructure projects, is the issue of land acquisition and involuntary settlement. People are sometimes constructing major highways. People are displaced and they are displaced involuntarily. How do you handle that in an ESG compliant way? And lastly, there is the issue of modern slavery that all of us have heard about, but sometimes we don't even appreciate the extent to which this affects us. To give an example, we're all talking about renewable energy, and we're talking about PV panels and all of that. Some of you will be aware that there is a major issue that one of the major provinces in China that produces these PV panels actually have issues with workers' condition, underage workers, and many companies are now rethinking how do we source our raw materials, from, ethical and ESG compliant companies. So it's really a very broad topic, but of course, the relevance or which of these, will be more relevant to a company will depend on many factors, including which industry are they operating in, which countries are they operating. So what applies to one company will not apply to another. For example, you talk about waste management. You see a law firm, for example, that's more limited. We are talking about a chemicals company, that's more of an issue. So this is really, what I want to sort of, highlight, that the topic is really broad and it's not only environment, but there is the social aspect, there is governance aspect. Can you please go to the previous slide, please? Where I want to talk about, how more important this whole topic is becoming. Look, This has been happening over the past few years. But if you look at what has happened during COVID, you try and say the whole aspect of social, employee welfare, employee mental health is becoming more important. But why do we focus on this as an investor that we are? The first thing is that this is really required to manage risk. If a company fails to manage some of the issues around this, the risk could crystallize and destroy the company. There are companies that have been accused of groundwater contamination, and the cost of remediation is massive. I mean, we've all heard about the whole saga in the Delta area, for example, where some of the IOCs have been operating for several years, and in the process, there has been environmental degradation, and you have seen the large number that courts have awarded for remediation. That is just a small example. So risk management is one of the benefits or the reasons why this is very important. But over and above that, it's also the issue of value creation. Of course, there is a direct link between managing your risk properly and preserving and growing value. But over and above that, when you see investors looking at businesses, there is a premium now that is being placed on companies that have excellent ESG practices. So it's actually not just to manage risk, it's also to ensure that you can distinguish your business from others by demonstrating, that you have best practice ESG measures in place. And number three is the issue of investment. I can speak for CDC. This is at the very center of what we do because we realize how important the topic is. And therefore, when we engage with businesses, whether there are fund managers, private equity funds, venture capital funds, or there are direct investee companies, we demand that our partners adopt ESG risk management practice that is world-class and ensures that all of these benefits are actually taken care of. In addition to that, I'm sure many of us have heard that the customers are becoming a lot more aware and they are demanding, especially the younger generation. They are becoming more aware and they are demanding. Some of them are actually advocating, boycotting businesses that they don't believe have got an excellent practice in this area. You see this quote I have here, from Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock in 2018, and he's saying that. And I want you to look at some of the words that I really love this quote. So some of the words he's actually using. And he's saying that a company's ability to manage environmental, social, and governance matters demonstrates the leadership and good governance that is so essential to sustain growth, which is why we are increasingly integrating these issues into our investment process. Companies must ask themselves, what role do we play in the community? How are we managing our impact on the environment? Are we working to create a diverse workforce? Are we adapting to technological change? Are we providing the retraining and opportunities that our employees and our business will need to adjust to an increasingly automated world? Are we using behavioral finance and other tools to prepare workers for retirement so that they invest in a way that will help them to achieve their goals? If you look at it, this is a really loaded quote. And there are so many aspects I've mentioned before, which you can see that Larry brings for. And what he's saying here resonates with me at CDC, significantly, because this is what we do as well. Next slide, please, or 2 slides after this. Thank you very much. Just about, talking about CDC and what is it we do, given how important this topic is for us. I want to make it very clear that in all the investment we do and managing our portfolio, ESG is a very critical consideration for us. And as CDC, when you look at the environment, which people tend to talk about mostly, we have developed a strategy to help us to manage, climate change. And there are 3 components of this. One is that we have committed that by 2050, our portfolio will achieve a net zero position. We're starting right now and working towards 2050, but that is the goal that we have publicly committed to. The second part is what I call a just transition. That's really saying that as people begin to really, address the impact of climate change and the related topics, you will see cases where there are people who are working in activities, business lines that may no longer actually exist because people are giving more consideration, to environmental matter. But the question is, what do you do to those people, the workers in those places? How do you help them to transition? The same thing with companies where they need to adapt. Maybe you see a company that has been, relying on coal, for example, to power, their plants, and now they need renewable energy, and you need new skills. This is one area that I think we look at in terms of just transition, supporting them to be able to make that move in terms of reskilling, retraining, financing, for them to be able to make the transition and preserve jobs at the same time. Then there is the issue of climate resilience and adaptation. We finance that, helping businesses to be able to strengthen their operations so that they are more resilient and they can adapt to the new situation. And in the other areas beyond environment, we apply the IFC performance standards. I'm happy to say that CDC, we are a founding member, a co-founding member of the 2X Challenge. This is really an initiative that is aimed at empowering women, not only as consumers, but as employees, as management, team members, and as well as board members. And when we work with that company, we are set extent to we can help them to be 2X, compliant. That is one thing that we're doing. Now, when we engage with businesses, we are quite pragmatic in the sense that we do know that, many businesses are just starting. They don't already have the skills. They need to go through a transition. So the approach we adopt is to engage with potential partners, review their operations, identify where they are, on the ESG ladder. And in most cases, we find opportunities for improvement. And when that happens, our approach is to engage with them and work with them to help them to be able to build the capabilities that we are looking for within their system. But in doing that, we are looking for willing partners because the journey is not always easy. So you need a willing partner who is going to work with you and embark on a journey to actually improve their ESG. Where that can work, and we have a partner that is willing, we embark on a journey. It's a contractual journey. And we try to address this issue. There are times when that willingness is not obvious, it's not clear. And when we see that, and there are significant ESG issues, we actually turn down deals. We have turned down many deals because the ESG risk is high and the partner is not willing actually to make that transition. We just let it go because the risk is just way too much, especially given who we are. So what I want to do in the last few minutes of my discussion is to show some examples of how CDC has worked with our partners to really up their game in one of each of these topics. Next slide, please. So thank you very much. The first one I want to talk about is really a business in Nigeria. This is a company called Coscharis Farms Limited. Some of you will know the company. And we invest, as CDC invested in Farfin, sponsored by Sahel Capital here in Lagos. And we committed $15 million in 2017, into Farfin, and Farfin made the investment in Coscharis. Now, what is the opportunity that we see? This company at the time, employed about 300 staff, and there is a plan to reach about 4,500 outgrower farmers. Now, when we look at this, one of the things we did was between the time that Sahel Capital invested and the time we were doing this evaluation, what changes has happened, to job quality due to this partnership with our partners? And that involved us actually engaging a consulting firm to do a survey of the entire workforce. And what that did was that it really revealed that almost half of the workers had different kind of challenges, in their daily jobs, to an extent that you can see that it affects productivity. And we identified the need and the opportunity to be able to improve worker satisfaction and improve job. That is the S part, of the ESG. So what did we do? We work with Sahel Capital and the company to actually develop a joint action plan on how we're going to address these job quality issues. In addition to that, we work with the company to hire an E&S manager, and the E&S manager was supported by an E&S officer to ensure there is capacity. We introduced new policies, new practices that actually took care of workers' well-being and their safety. They introduced a performance appraisal system, which really helped people to see, how they can improve their career. And in addition to that, we look at assessment of employees' training needs in a very systematic way. At the end of all of this, you could see the difference that this was able to make in terms of employee satisfaction and issue of job quality. That is one example of how we have done it. So it's really using data and survey to improve job quality. Next slide, please. The second one was really how we promoted female work in forestry. As you will realize, this is when you look at that line of business, you typically don't see many women in that business. So this is an investment we made in Myro Forestry, which has got a plantation in Ghana as well as in Sierra Leone. Today they have over 10,000 hectares of standing forest, in these two countries. And CDC invested $15 million equity in this company. Now, in terms of what the opportunity was, the company noticed that increasingly there was a high level of attrition and absenteeism level just continued to increase. And that's sort of indicates there is something wrong here in terms of what is happening here. And as part of finding the solution, one of the options we look at was, you do need to increase the proportion of the female workforce because, let's face it, women are really more stable and you can depend on them a lot. I'm not saying men are not dependable. I'm just saying that this is one thing you see about the female gender. So this company embarked on an approach to deliberately increase the proportion of women in the workforce. And what did we do? We have what we call ESG impact team and our agenda team work with the company to develop an action plan. You see all these things, it starts with an action plan. I
apologize for the breaks in transmission. We seem to be losing sound intermittently. And I think I see Benson's screen is frozen. Are you back?
Yes, can you hear me?
I'm not sure he's back.
Okay, maybe I'll go out and come back. Just a second.
Benson?
Yes, I was hearing him, Falaki.
I think that we should. Sorry, Sarah, I didn't hear that.
I was just saying I was hearing quite clearly. I think it might be the internet on your side.
Oh, I see. All right. Okay. I'll let him continue.
Can you hear me?
Do we still have Benson?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, that's much better. Please go on.
Okay.
Apologies for that.
I just have a few more minutes and then I'll wrap up.
And thanks to the audience because they want to hear what you're saying.
All right, yeah.
They're all saying we can hear him very well. So
okay.
I'm going to stop talking and let you.
Okay, that's fine. So I was saying that. So what we did here, is that we developed a gender action plan. And I was making the point that all of this usually starts with an action plan. You do a review, you identify the gaps, you develop an action plan. And, we looked at how do we empower women in the area, or where these plantations are, to get them into the workforce. And we employed together with the company, a female ESG manager who actually grew to now be a director, in the company. And in 2020, my role qualified for the 2X challenge. And the result of this engagement is that the ratio of workforce increased to 40%. And we learned quite a bit of lesson in terms of women empowerment and how you need to about cultural sensitivities, lessons that we learned in the process. Next slide, please. All right, so this one is around, how did we shape, labor condition and safety culture in Egypt? And this is a very interesting situation. This was a company called Nubian Sons. It's part of the Benban solar park. This is a major part of Egypt's strategy, to achieve net zero, by 2050. Now, CDC invested $92 million in 9 solar parks with significant environmental benefit. But what we noticed really was that when our ESG team did the review, it was very clear that the workforce was really inexperienced and the level of safety awareness was very low. In addition to that, we invested in 9 different parks, different contractors, different approaches to ESG. And so it became clear to us that it's going to be very difficult for us to have, get each of the contractors to comply with the standard we want. So we really look at how we work with other lenders to work together and really shape the way this works. And it's just illustrating the fact that lenders can play a significant role in actually shaping this. In this particular case, all the lenders came together and we implemented a common approach across all the contractors. And we had to employ, consultants who work with the companies to put together, a world-class ESMS and put this into practice. And the CDC's Responsible Investment Code was actually leveraged as well. And this covered quite a wide range. There was training and all of that to really help this company to be able to address this point. Because of time, I will talk about the last case very quickly. And this is really in the healthcare space in India. Next slide, please.
Fantastic.
So in this particular case, this is really a resource efficiency opportunity. Now, Narayana Healthcare in India is a major hospital. This hospital serves 1.2 million customers annually, and they operate 18 hospitals. The opportunity is this. As you know, hospitals and medical centers, they are really resource intensive. Use of water, use of electricity, they are intensive. And as many of us may know, India is one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. So the approach here is, how do you help this company to be able to really manage resources in a more efficient way? And the approach we took was that, again, our ESG team worked with them to really, help the company to transition into more renewable energy sources. In fact, there was a business case because, like many of us are used to, electricity was not, regular in many of those areas. And therefore, it's not only helping them to reduce costs, it's also helping them to really ensure that you have power, every time as much as possible. And what we did here, and we still do this, CDC funded, water, energy, and waste audits to identify opportunity for resource efficiency. And we together work with the company to put together a plan. At the end of the day, the company was able to reduce water consumption by 20%, and they were able to recycle water more. And when you look at this, the impact of this goes to the bottom line. So there is, profitability benefit from this as well. The last slide, please. Last slide, please. Yes, just to talk about some of the issues I've seen in terms of, what the challenges have been. You've had me talk about consultants, audits, and all of that. So that means that when we are trying to implement this, it actually could be costly. I have to be very honest about that. It will vary from where the company is coming from. And sometimes the cost constraint prevents some people from actually adopting this. In addition to that, the environments in which we operate is not many industries that have defined, ESG as a standard. And when it's not that defined and there are businesses doing whatever they want to do, when you engage the partner and say, we want you to adopt ESG, but you're saying, look, I'm incurring this cost. The other guys are not doing that. Won't that disadvantage me? But the reality is the value you can create over time is going to actually be higher than whatever savings people are having. So the competitive pressure, the cost issues are really those factors that, sometimes hinder people from doing the best. I think my closing statement is that ESG is critical. It's going to become more critical. People like us, and I'm sure that Tokunbo will talk about it as well, are willing to support in our investee companies to be able to adopt this best practices because it will pay off. You manage your risk, you create value, you attract best practitioner investors who can support your growth down the line. This is something that we will not be able to avoid, but will continue to become more important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was very valuable. I particularly enjoyed the stories that you shared of your experiences in different emerging markets and developing economies. That is just gold. Thank you. And I'll use the opportunity as well to commend CDC and the Global Private Capital Association on the ESG Performance Award that they're giving to private capital fund providers. I think tomorrow is the last day for submission for that. And it's another sort of value-adding promotional support that you're giving to boost the flow of finance to markets and economies and businesses that hitherto would not or who struggle to get that kind of finance. Thank you. I was particularly sort of excited to hear about your work in Myra Forestry, the female, I think it's female-led. You said it's now managed by a female director, which is fascinating. And it sort of leads me into our next presenter, which is Tokunbo Ishmael, who is founder and co-manager at Alethea Capital. She's also chair of the board of the African Venture Capital Association, which has been running an ESG series of training. I think it continues until at least December, so you might want to look that up. But ahead of that, I'm excited to have Tokunbo as well speak to us today. Without further ado, I'd like to invite her to tell us about what Alethea has been doing in terms of ESG. ESG and social impact are the very core. They're the DNA of Alethea. We've been privileged to work with them on a few matters, and we have found it rewarding and interesting and very inspiring. I look forward to learning in particular how they've been deploying technology and innovation in implementing their gender lens investing toolkit and other policies. Tokunbo?
Thank you, Folake, for that introduction, and thank you to your colleagues for arranging this session, and thank you to my co-panelists. And Benson, it's been way too many years, and it's good to make your acquaintance again on this platform. So yes, I'm Tokunbo Ishmael, Managing Director and co-founder of Alethea Capital. We are an ESG and impact investing firm. We believe that actually at the heart of investments, you can't just focus on financial returns, but social returns are also important. And that's how the company came about 15 years ago. So like Folake said, ESG and impact are at the DNA of our company. We started in 2007 with the mandate of looking at how we could be more inclusive with financial services and energy. And that led us to be more innovative in things that we tried to invest in at the time. And as a result, we're one of the pioneer investors in fintech, one of the very early investors in Paga, who's going a lot of places, because we recognize that technology was definitely important over 15 years ago within the Africa context to enable the broader access to essential services and affordable essential services at that, especially with respect to health, education, and finance. But today I'm going to particularly focus on one of our funds, which is the Alethea IDF Fund. If you could go to the next slide, please, which is a fund that is focused on investing with a gender lens. For us, we believe that intentionally investing with a gender lens and being intentional about diversity from the boardroom through to the factory floor actually increases corporate performance by 20%. That's a 20% premium on a company's performance just by being more diverse. And why is that? Well, we talk about the dividends of gender diversity, which for us include better decision-making, better corporate governance, and enhanced innovation. And in particular, when we talk about innovation, for many, we very quickly go to think about tech, which I've mentioned earlier, but it's also about when you're diverse in your thinking and you recognize that women globally make the decision on over $15 trillion of purchasing, so the purchasing power, that you have to think about products that can target your customers in the broad sense and be more innovative. One of the great examples that I like to give is with respect to seatbelts. Seatbelts in cars became mandatory, I think late 50s and early 60s. But it wasn't until probably about 2 decades ago that the seatbelts were actually better fitted to suit the female physiology. And as a result of that, we saw a drastic reduction in deaths from both the passenger and the driver, just because the seatbelt has been better customized. So when we think about gender diversity, we also think about it in terms of the innovative products on the consumption side. But like I said, we think about this with intentionality, both from the boardroom all the way down to the factory floor. Next slide, please. So what does that mean for us as a fund? So Alethea IDF is the $100 million fund, which is really looking to deploy capital into female-led businesses and businesses that have female impact. Now, first and foremost, we want to see diversity in terms of the founders in the ecosystem and the ownership of businesses. Over 40% of businesses on the African continent are owned by women. Or less than 5% of those actually have access to the kind of growth capital that Alethea IDF is able to provide. So we're very intentional about seeking out female founders for ownership. But for us, gender diversity doesn't end there. And it's interesting to hear from CDC, because when we first started in terms of thinking about a gender diversity fund about 5 years ago, the key mantra back then for many of the funders, including the DFIs, was around ownership. And I'm glad to see that that thinking has now shifted. And Alethea IDF is one of the 2X challenge funds that is seen as a pioneer in the space. And for us, like I said, moving on from ownership, we're thinking about leadership, management, the board, governance. Like I said, when you're intentional about diversity, you have to be intentional about that from the boardroom all the way down to the factory floor. We think about employment. How do we ensure that women are not just attracted to certain companies, but they are retained? All of us can tell the story of at least one woman in our lives who left the workplace because their situation changed, their family situation changed, and they could no longer remain employed. But how do we work with companies to make sure that the environment is still suited for them to stay as productive contributors within the workplace. Because if we're thinking just about ownership and management, guess what? The line management is what feeds into the management suite, the C-suite, and ownership. So we have to make sure that we're not losing women at that point. We also think about diversity within the value chain. Who are the people that are being employed within the value chain? For us, a big area that we look at is food security. And so agriculture is a big area, agribusinesses. And we see that agriculture is one of the largest employers of women in Africa. And we see that smallholder farmers are particularly impacted by the work in the value chain in terms of how they are brought on to participate, how they are compensated. And one of the things that we seek to do is to make sure that as producers within the value chain and as distributors or retailers, that women are getting a fair wage and that their economic well-being is being enhanced. And like I mentioned earlier, on the consumption front as well, this is a key area, because if women hold the purchasing power on $15 trillion of decisions globally, how can you not think about how to better meet their tastes and preferences? And if you're doing that, how can you not think about your company having that diversity? Now, I've said a lot here with respect to how we think about this through the whole company ecosystem. But one thing that I want to stress is that we don't just see this as a moral obligation. We see it as an economic imperative, because like I said earlier, for us, intentional diversity adds 20% to corporate performance, but also, as McKinsey states, we're missing out on the almost $28 trillion globally that could be added to GDP if we don't fully have women participate in the economy. So for us, it's both sides of the coin. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned about the fund, it's $100 million. We make equity investments. We have some key sectors I mentioned earlier about agribusiness. We look at essential consumer goods and services, health, finance, education are some particular areas that we are concerned about. We also look at impact. So yes, we want environmental, social, and governance considerations to take place, but we want to be intentional about our impact and how we measure that impact. And then that also then feeds down to what's the specific gender impact. Intentionality is important. How do we increase income in the hands of women? How do we support women in the supply chain to ensure a lift up in their income and their economic welfare? How do we ensure that women and girls have better access to essential services, better access to maternal health, better access to education for girls? And how do we ensure that women-led businesses, that gap that I spoke about, that over 40% of companies that are missing out on financing for their companies to grow, how do we ensure that we plug that gap? So it's a multi-level approach. Next slide, please. Now, when we started thinking intentionally about gender diversity and how do we invest to ensure that Africa reaches its full economic potential with the full participation of what we call Africa's most underutilized asset, women, we started to think about how can we communicate this both to our investors, but also communicate this to the companies that we're investing in. Because sometimes we do actually invest in male-led businesses, but we want to help them achieve a gender consciousness that helps them to perform better. Like I said, better decision-making, better corporate governance, enhanced innovation. How do we help these companies reach that? And how do we communicate that? And in order to do that, we pioneered a gender lens investing toolkit, which is the Alethea IDF Gender Lens Toolkit. And what that toolkit does for us is we don't have investment members in my team that purely look at the finance or purely look at the ESG. everybody starts off from the same sheet thinking, can we get good financial returns? Can we get good social returns? How gender conscious is this business? What interventions do we need to bring to the table to ensure that that gender consciousness continues? So the toolkit enables us to embed the gender lens at every step of the investment process. It helps us to think through the organization, its value chain, its vendors, its customers. It helps us to actively think about the interventions that are required for us to be able to create value for financial returns, value for social returns, really looking at value creation. And that for us is what drives to the superior performance that we expect from companies that are more diverse in their teams. Of course, there are many aspects to diversity. Our focus in particular is around the gender diversity. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the flow of our toolkit. We have 5 phases for our investment. We look at screening, which is from the very moment that we begin to speak to a company, we begin to think about where they are placed with their gender consciousness and what do we need to do to, what interventions need to come to place. As we look at the due diligence, we look at what they're telling us with respect to their gender consciousness, their capacity, and how we can diagnose what best to bring into the firm. And we have 2 strands for looking at the financial capacity, and where we're looking at food security and agribusiness, we have specific tools to help us think about where in the value chain. Is it the smallholder farmers that need to be particularly focused on for intervention? Is it the distributors? Is it the agro processors? How do we ensure the exact intervention? And then when we come to the investment execution and we've rated where the company is, and then we think about, okay, how does this drive returns, both in terms of KPIs for social returns, but also for financial returns? How do we think about how they need to skill up to be able to meet what we're looking for? And then obviously, as we begin to, as we make the investment and our monitoring then picks up on the things that we have set in those previous stages. Next slide, please. So I just want to very quickly run through an example. This is a tea company founded in 2014, working with thousands of smallholder farmers who are picking the tea, and the company is then processing the tea for export. And this company's products can be found actually in the US and the UK. And so it's really taken the work of the hands of these smallholder farmers to the shelves in cosmopolitan cities. Now, the key thing for us with respect to this company is it has had an uplift in its finances, but also it has actually lifted the income of the smallholder farmers 10 times, because by coming on, they were very intentional about the yield and educating these farmers, who are majority women, on how best to get the increased yield, how to take care of themselves in the field, and therefore also feed that into the yield process. So for us, the opportunity to impact on those smallholder farmers and at the same time impact on the bottom line for the company, we could draw a link between that. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to very quickly show from this slide, it's quite busy, but if you look, this is stage 1 in the screening process. If you look at the bottom left of the screen, you see how we rate the company. So we rate companies from gender negative to gender aware, gender proactive to gender strategic. And obviously our intervention differs based on where we see the need. And that rating is done across the areas I talked about. Women in ownership, you see that this company is particularly strategic, it's gender strategic because it's owned by a woman. more than 50%. It's gender aware on the management teams. There's still a balance matter there. It's about 40%, and we'd like to see more. For women employees, it's gender strategic. The more than 70% are female within the staff in makeup there. With respect to suppliers, and this is where we come to think about the smallholder farmers, the women suppliers, this company is gender proactive. And then with respect to the customers, because in this particular case, the company also supplies tea to tea homes and tea franchises, which are owned by female proprietors. And so it's also generating income and well-being for those customers as well. And so we combine these different scores and already begin to say, okay, this company is gender proactive. And so based on that, where do we need to make interventions in the different areas to move the company into being gender strategic? And next slide, please. And this follows through for each stage of our due diligence. And I'm not going to go through each detail, but it helps us to come up with a plan so that we can move the company along. Now, if you saw on the previous slide, I said gender negative is a rating. Just because a company is gender negative doesn't mean that we won't invest in the company. And indeed, we do invest in those kinds of companies, but we're very clear about including language in our investment agreements that helps the company move forward in terms of interventions and being intentional about meeting certain KPIs with respect to ownership, presence at the board, employees, supply chain, and the kinds of products, making sure that the products can be affordable and accessible for women and the broader population. Next slide, please. And the same thing all the way through. Next slide. So this is just showing you extracts from our reports and really just emphasizing that this is not, for us, it's not an addition after we've made an investment. It starts from the very moment we do the screening and is really inculcated in the DNA of the company. Next slide. Next slide, please. Same thing. Okay, so this is just a summary of how we look at it from the toolkit perspective. And I think someone asked about availability for slides. We're happy to run through this with anyone afterwards or provide follow-up in terms of summaries on this. Next slide. Okay, sorry, that was my last slide. So just one last wrap up, because you'd asked me about this, Folake, when we were talking in terms of I think I've spoken about the opportunities enough, but just in terms of the challenges. Now, less so now than previously, the whole matter of impact versus profit was a big debate. Can you be ESG focused and seek impact and make profit? For us, really ESG and impact are factors that drive superior performance. And particularly with this fund, we have other funds that invest for financial inclusion, energy, etc., that are seeking particular impact. And for this fund and those funds, for us, the ESG and impact factors are superior drivers of performance. And we don't, nowadays the debate has changed and we have more vanguards on the side of the potential to do that, but we still have some naysayers. And that brings me to the next challenge, which is that at the moment, with the strategies that are intentional about factoring ESG and impact, we still have a concentration of foreign investors in this area. In this most recent fund, we have been fortunate to attract 2 local investors, the Bank of Industry and the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But for this, these strategies to not just grow just for the sake of growing, but for us to really drive impact in Africa and for Africa to reach its full potential, we need to see more domestic capital focused in this area, more patient domestic capital. So that's an area that I would say is needs to be looked at more. And I think more people need to embrace this at the DNA of their investment process. And so we're happy to share the Alethea IDF Gender Toolkit for use more broadly. Thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Perfect. Thank you very much, Tokunbo. I'm excited to hear about the financing that you've attracted locally from the Sovereign Wealth Fund and from the Bank of Industry. That's fantastic news. As you're aware, as a member of the Impact Investors Foundation, we've been working with the Ministry for Finance, Budgets and National Planning, the Impact Foundation, and so on. We did a mapping exercise report on the legal and regulatory framework for social impact investment in Nigeria. Absolutely. And I find it very encouraging that you now have active investment by local LP in funds such as yourself. I'm very encouraged.
It's great. And you've just reminded me as well. We spoke about the Africa Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, of which I'm the chair. All the training that has been going on for the past year with respect to the ESG and impact that AFCA, the association, have been providing, will be available via the AFCA Training Academy, which is now digital. So you can, on demand, in your own time, go back to that resource and leverage that resource to learn more about leveraging ESG and impact factors as you think about your investments, and even for your company, thinking about how do I position my company for superior performance, and how do I even attract capital.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that those two presentations have been fantastic for setting the scene. We have seen the CDC DFI perspective. We've heard Tokunbo's perspectives from general partner and a fund manager, as a general partner and a fund manager, and also in her capacity as chair of AFCA. I'd like to speak with Nicole next. Nicole has been involved in the policy aspect of things in her role as head of Africa and the Middle East for the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investing. That major role is coming to an end, though I understand she will still continue in a consultant capacity with the UNPRI. But very excitingly, she set up her own shop with Martin's Impact Advisory, which is very, very good news. And I hope that she's going to tell us some of the things that she's hoping to achieve in that with Martin's. Now, one of the first articles that I've seen referring to the Africanness of ESG investing was written by Nicole while she was in that role. If you haven't read it, please go on the UNPRI website and download it. I thought it's very short, very snappy, and very enjoyable. So the first question that I'm going to throw at Nicole is, how is Africanness driving responsible investing?
Yeah, thanks very much, Folake, and thanks again for the invitation to be here with you guys today. Speaking of the Africanness, I'm in the middle of a very sub-Saharan African rainstorm, so if my signal goes funny or you hear it in the background, just note that we're very grateful for the rain. So yeah, I think it's a great question, and the Africanness of responsible investment, sustainable investment, I think it's part of sort of our culture is that, and again, we'd be very careful not to refer to Africa as one homogenous unit because we don't want to be accused of that, of course. But one of the biggest things is that in general, most cultures across Africa, and I'm South African, and we believe in the concept of Ubuntu, which is that we know that the benefit of the many is for the benefit of the individual, and that we understand that when we're looking at things like investments, you need to invest in a way that is good for the whole.